Welcome to part 2 of Modern 1. And we ended the last audio lecture talking about the Surrealists that went into the unconscious mind. So now we're going to go to the whole other end of the spectrum and begin with the Bauhaus. So we have the Surrealists making work that is free of the rational mind, and the Bauhaus school believed, on the other hand, in an ideal world, completely run by what? Rational thought. So with the Bauhaus, that was founded in Germany, they believed that rational mind was the key to solve all the world's problems. And in retrospect, I would say a little bit of intuition, imagination, and a little bit of rational mind balanced makes for the wisest choice. But I digress. Let's talk about the Bauhaus. Now, the founder of the school was a guy named Walter Gropius, and he sought to reconcile modern art and industry through what he called cultural synthesis. One of the things he did that was very interesting was that he believed that an artisan should be trained in every aspect of his art. So if someone wanted to be an architect, they needed to understand every aspect of the building process before creating a structure. So the architect builds a house, for example. He had a school of arts and crafts, and it taught streamlined design principles, and it employed many avant-garde artists. This school building is pictured above, and you can see the design ideas, and I'm sure you can see how they went through into the 1960s. In 1933, the school was closed by Hitler, and many of the artists moved to the U.S. Here we have a couple of more examples of Bauhaus. There's an interior to the left and a factory building, and they both reflect this clean, rational look. I don't know about you, but that room to the left, it doesn't look that warm and inviting to me. Pretty cold and rational, eh? So this was one of the responses to the technological advances of the time, and it's really important to consider how many things came to be during this very relatively short period of time. As I said, electricity, flight, telephone, phonograph, movies, on and on. So there was a belief that came out of that time. It was like a utopian vision of how humans could live. By using just rational thought, people could create a new kind of world that would be ruled by efficiency, and this would create an ideal civilization. One of the big schools of this thought was called the Futurists, and they came out of this same time and had the same basic belief. They thought that the faster pace of life had fundamentally altered humanity in a positive way, and that we had to have a whole new approach to making art, because now we had these big high speeds that we could now move at. Now, there's a kind of a troubling aspect of the manifesto from the Futurists. Now, all these schools, Surrealists, Dadaists, Fauvists, they all had a manifesto, which is the paper that tells what they're all about. So the Futurist manifesto had this passage, I'm quoting now, that we will glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world. We will destroy museums and fight against all utilitarian cowardice. Now that's kind of troubling, maybe for art, but even more than that, this helped to create Italian fascism under the leader Mussolini in World War II. So the art's kind of cool, but the philosophy behind it, I question. The sculpture to the right is by Umberto Bocchini, and he's one of the founding members of the Futurists. It's called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. So let's move on from the Futurists to Pablo Picasso. He's one of the best known and most productive artists of the 20th century. Now I want you to look at this piece on the left, okay, right here. You know he painted that when he was 15 years old? So Picasso was a prodigy. His dad was an art professor, but then my feeling is once he learned how to paint that realistically, where to go from there? I mean, is he going to spend the rest of his life doing portraits? Oh no, he went way away from realism and became the Picasso that we know. Here's another picture of someone that he painted when he was 49. Let's go a little bit more deeply into the life of Picasso. His father taught him to master these academic techniques at a very young age. By the time he was in his late teens, he was kind of bored with this way of making art, and that led him to explore other creative endeavors. When he was just 19, he left his native Spain and he went to explore the avant-garde art scene in Paris. While here, he was strongly influenced by the work of the post-impressionists, and we can see this in the painting above left. If you think about the artist Gauguin, it really reflects these influences. And this is a picture of an art dealer, painted by Picasso when he was 20. Now, throughout his life, Picasso constantly changed styles and his approaches to making art. This painting in the middle, The Boy with the Pipe, was painted just 5 years later. And to the right is an etching called The Frugal Repast. And now he's beginning to create figures that are less representational and more symbolic. This one on the right came along when he was at a dark period. Even Picasso had to go through a period of time where he wasn't making much money and had kind of a crummy little studio in Paris. And this is reflected in his work. Soon after Picasso's arrival in Paris, he entered what is known as his blue period. And obviously you can see why. There's a self-portrait at age 20 on the left, and then a guy playing guitar on the right. So let's talk about Cubism. A lot of people don't really understand Cubism, but here's a good way to look at it. It's like you're looking at something from all sides at once. It's like you took a picture and cut it apart and put it back together. So let's go back to talk about Picasso and his work with Cubism. He didn't want to just rest on his successes. Throughout his life, Picasso would take these great chances and try new things. And Cubism was one of those. This piece called Mademoiselles d'Avignon was his first effort at Cubism. Now, you can see his fascination with primitive art in this work. He's broken up all the planes to these very simple shapes. While this is very confusing to the eye and it almost looks haphazard, this is meticulously planned, and he kept painting over and over to get it just right for his vision. When it was first shown, you can imagine it was rather shocking, and one critic said it resembled a field of broken glass. Now, as with the Impressionists, the critics insulted the work and called it Cubism, and that became the name for the new style. And it continues to develop for many years to come. That's the first Cubist work. Here's a few more. Now, his peers scoffed at Picasso's early Cubist works, but pretty soon they were all getting into it themselves. The one to the left, to me, most easily shows Cubism and what it's about. It's called Nude Descending a Staircase. So if you look closely, you can see that person starting at the top, coming all the way down the stairs. It's like they've taken all these different aspects of movement and they've put them together in this painting. Now consider, motion pictures were just becoming possible to make. They were just becoming popular. So these artists are trying to push their limits in visual art to keep up with the world around them. The other one is by Georges Braque, and he was the one who actually he was a very good friend of Picasso's, and it is credited that Braque and Picasso were the people who created Cubism. Write that down. Braque, B-R-A-Q-U-E, and Picasso. So Braque actually became one of the major Cubist artists. Oh, now this is something I really want you to know. In fact, you are going to need to tell me the story of this painting at some point in the very near future. So let's talk about Guernica. As tension in Europe increased in the 1930s, Picasso began to paint images that reflected his despair at this ongoing violence. There was one particular incident in the spring of 1937. The town of Guernica, the ancient capital of the Basque people, was bombed by the Nazis because they just wanted to experiment with a new technique they called saturation bombing. As a result, thousands of innocent people were killed, civilians. This painting is 11.5 feet high and over 25.5 feet long, so it's huge. And Picasso painted this as a reaction to the violence. He said he couldn't use color because there was no color in such atrocity. And he painted it prior to World War II, but the saturation bombing that he was protesting, it became a standard practice. Now this piece has an interesting history because it was painted for the Spanish pavilion at the Paris World Expo in 1938, but it was too controversial. So it had to be hidden away. It was actually smuggled to New York City, rolled up, and then taken out later. And now it's a great masterpiece. So I am going to ask you to tell me briefly the story of Guernica. So you can read about it in your book. You can take it from here. But it's one that, you know, any fan of art should probably know that story. So I'll hold you to that. And I invite you to look at Guernica and consider why he painted it. Oh, Georgia O'Keeffe. It says this week's movie. We have many movies, and the full movie is no longer available. So I'm going to edit that right now and tell you that one of our movies includes an excerpt from a documentary about Georgia O'Keeffe. And she had such a strong spirit and a unique style. It made her a force to be reckoned with in this male-dominated art world of the early 1900s. Now, one of the things that Georgia had going for her is that she was married to Alfred Stieglitz. So who was she married to? Alfred Stieglitz. You should remember that as well. Now, the piece to the left really shows Stieglitz's kind of idea about photography. And in addition to being a photographer, Stieglitz had a gallery in Manhattan. It was on the second floor. It was a small gallery, but what he did was he showcased modern artists. Someone sent him a roll of Georgia O'Keeffe's drawings that she had made. She went on a kind of a retreat in Texas where she was teaching, and she just shut out the world and she made these drawings. And her girlfriend, a friend of hers, mailed them to Stieglitz, and he was infatuated. And he did a show of her work. He really helped to make her the famous artist that she became. And then the two were married. So I love this piece on the right called The Steerage. These are immigrants that are on the people below. They're the low-income people. They have paid the lowest cost, and they're all just crammed in there, and they're just coming into the U.S. So you can see these people both desperate and exhausted, and yet still so human. I find that a very beautiful piece, and it's one of his most famous. So we're going to end with a couple of American realists. We've been looking at this move away from realism, but let's go back. This is a painting called Nighthawks by Edward Hopper, painted in 1942. Now consider the feeling in the country at that time as we were just entering into World War II. But beyond that, Edward Hopper's work, no matter what he paints, it always looks kind of lonely and sad. He had this way of depicting space, and because of this, he would appeal to fans of modern art as well as more traditional art patrons. In Hopper's work, even the simplest scene takes on this feeling of a starkness and sadness. He is a master at portraying isolation. And you know, when you look at his life story, he wasn't that happy. So that's probably why he did that. Here's a guy I love, Henry O. Tanner, and he's an American Impressionist. This was painted around 1905, and what I want you to notice, this piece is called The Thankful Poor. But look at how he's been so creative with his use of color, orange and blue on the walls. Look at his loose brush strokes. Now, the truth of Henry O. Tanner is that he was very popular in Europe, but he couldn't really make it in this country because of racism. He was an African American artist, and yet he is one of the truly great American artists of the period. Well, this concludes the slide lecture on the first phase of modern art, and we'll continue with Modern 2 in the next slide lecture. Thanks for listening.